200 million locked in. The words slipped through the low hum of crystal glasses and quiet laughter, barely louder than the clink of ice in a whiskey tumbler. But Claire Bennett heard them as clearly as if they had been spoken directly into her ear, and for a fraction of a second, her hand stopped midair, the tray balanced perfectly between motion and stillness, her eyes lowering just slightly as something behind her calm expression shifted, recalculating, aligning, recognizing a pattern that didn't fit, because numbers like that didn't just float carelessly in conversations unless they were anchored to something real, something binding, something final, and yet the tone, too casual, too confident, didn't match the weight of what had just been said, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, not the number itself, but the way it was handled, as if certainty had replaced verification, as if assumption had quietly stepped into the place of truth, and Claire moved again, slow, precise, placing a glass of sparkling water onto the polished table without a sound, her posture composed, invisible, exactly what she was expected to be in a place like this, where people in tailored suits spoke in millions as if they were discussing dinner plans, and no one ever looked twice at the person refilling their glass, no one except her, because Claire listened, always, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, the kind built over years of studying systems where a single misplaced decimal could collapse an entire structure. And she didn't need the full conversation, she never did, just fragments, 3 words, a percentage, a clause mentioned too quickly, and her mind filled in the rest, reconstructing the unseen document as if it were laid out in front of her. And now the image forming in her head didn't balance, the numbers didn't reconcile, and the more she replayed that one sentence, the clearer it became that something fundamental had been overlooked, not by accident, but by assumption, the most expensive kind of mistake, and still she kept walking, because this wasn't her table, wasn't her meeting, wasn't her place, and people like Ethan Caldwell didn't get corrected by waitresses, they got agreed with, validated, followed, and Ethan was laughing now, relaxed, confident, a man who had never needed to second-guess himself, his voice carrying just enough authority to quiet the others at the table without effort, and Claire passed behind him, unseen, unheard, exactly as expected, but her steps slowed for just a moment, a hesitation so small no one would notice, except her, because inside, the calculation had finished, and the result was undeniable, the deal they were about to close wasn't just flawed, it was structurally broken, a misinterpretation buried inside a clause that shifted the entire valuation, turning what should have been a gain into a silent loss, and not a small one. Not something that could be corrected later, but something that would lock in the moment signatures hit the page, irreversible, final, and she reached the service station, setting the tray down with careful precision, her fingers steady even as her thoughts pressed forward, telling her to let it go, to stay invisible, to keep moving, because stepping in meant crossing a line that wasn't hers to cross. And yet the number echoed again in her mind. 200 million, too large to ignore, too clear to dismiss, and Claire exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting just enough to find the table again, her expression unchanged, calm, distant, but her direction already decided, because some mistakes were too loud to stay silent, even for someone who had built her life on being unseen. Claire stood at the service station for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter as the noise of the restaurant flowed around her, unchanged, indifferent, and for anyone watching, there was nothing unusual about her pause, just another server waiting for her next task. But inside, the sequence continued to unfold with quiet precision, each detail locking into place, the structure of the deal reconstructing itself line by line, and the flaw remained, persistent, undeniable, a single misread clause tied to a revenue projection that had been treated as guaranteed instead of conditional, a difference that shifted liability in a way that no one at that table seemed to have caught, and Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but to confirm what she already knew, because she had learned a long time ago that hesitation did not come from doubt. It came from understanding the consequences of being right in the wrong place. And when she opened them again, the decision had already been made, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty she used to carry plates through crowded aisles without spilling a drop, and she turned, picking up a fresh bottle of mineral water as if that had been her intention all along. Her steps measured, controlled, blending seamlessly back into the rhythm of the room, until she reached the table again, where Ethan Caldwell sat at the center, his posture relaxed, one arm resting along the back of his chair, the other gesturing lightly as he spoke, his voice calm, confident. The kind of confidence that came from years of being the smartest person in every room, and the others leaned in, nodding, agreeing, because that was what people did around him. They aligned, they followed, they trusted, and Claire waited for the smallest opening, not interrupting, not forcing her presence, just standing there with the quiet patience of someone who understood timing better than words, until the conversation paused for a fraction of a second, just enough, and she stepped forward slightly, her voice soft, even, almost blending into the air itself. "Excuse me, sir." And for a moment, no one reacted, because it was not a voice that demanded attention, but it carried just enough clarity to reach him, and Ethan's eyes shifted toward her, briefly, distracted, as if acknowledging a minor interruption, and she met his gaze without challenge, without apology, just steady, composed, and continued. "I think there might be an error in the projection you mentioned." And the words settled over the table like a subtle disturbance, not loud enough to alarm, but enough to be noticed, and one of the men let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if amused by the idea itself, while another leaned back, clearly uninterested, because in their world, corrections did not come from someone holding a water bottle, and Ethan's expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes sharpened, a flicker of curiosity mixed with irritation, the natural response of someone unaccustomed to being questioned from below his line of sight. And he set his glass down slowly, the soft click against the table louder than it should have been. "And what exactly makes you think that?" he asked, his tone controlled, not raised, but unmistakably firm. The kind of tone that established distance without needing to emphasize it. And Claire did not rush to answer, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply placed the bottle down beside the others, her movements precise, deliberate, before looking back at him, her voice unchanged, calm, grounded. "The clause tied to the revenue floor is conditional, not fixed, which means the valuation shifts if the threshold is not met." And she stopped there, allowing the sentence to stand on its own, without explanation, without defense, because she knew that if she was wrong, nothing she added would matter, and if she was right, she would not need to say anything else. And for the first time since she had approached the table, the room did not immediately respond. The laughter faded before it could fully form, and Ethan's gaze held on her just a moment longer than before, not dismissing her, not accepting her, but calculating, as if something in what she said had reached a place he had not expected to be challenged, and the air shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough for Claire to feel it, the beginning of a pause that had not existed seconds ago. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and unfamiliar, settling over the table as if the air itself had shifted weight, and Ethan Caldwell did not respond immediately, which in itself was the first signal that something had changed, because men like him filled silence, controlled it, shaped it, but now he simply looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as his mind moved through what she had said, not emotionally, not defensively, but analytically, and across from him, one of the executives cleared his throat, offering a quiet chuckle that did not quite land. "That clause has already been reviewed," he said, his voice carrying the polite dismissal reserved for interruptions that were not supposed to matter. But Ethan did not echo the sentiment. He did not nod, did not wave her off. Instead, his fingers moved slowly toward the folder in front of him, the motion deliberate, unhurried, as if he were not reacting to her, but to something deeper, something internal that had been triggered by a detail he could not immediately ignore. And he opened the document, flipping past the summary pages he had already memorized, past the projections he had approved, until he reached the section she had referenced, and the room watched, uncertain now, because the confidence that had filled the space moments ago was no longer absolute, and Claire remained exactly where she stood, not stepping forward, not retreating, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome of this moment had already detached itself from her. and Ethan's eyes scanned the text quickly at first, then slower, his focus tightening, the rhythm of his breathing shifting just enough to be noticed if someone were paying close attention. And then it happened, not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but in the smallest of movements. His hand paused on the page, his gaze fixing on a single line that had likely been read before, approved before, trusted before, but never truly questioned in the way it needed to be. And the realization did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as clarity, precise and unavoidable, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. And the executive across from him leaned in slightly. "Everything all right?" he asked, but Ethan did not answer. Not yet, because he was still reading, still recalculating. The numbers shifting in his mind as the assumption collapsed and the true structure revealed itself underneath. And Claire could see it now, not in his words, but in the stillness, the way his presence changed, the subtle withdrawal of certainty. And when he finally looked up, it was not at the document, not at his colleagues, but at her, directly, fully, for the first time since she had spoken. And there was no irritation in his expression now, no dismissal, only focus, sharp and measured, as if he were reassessing something he had previously categorized as insignificant. And the room followed his gaze, their attention shifting with his, and the weight of it landed on Claire without altering her stance, because she had never stepped into the moment for recognition, only for correction. And Ethan closed the folder slowly, the soft sound echoing louder than it should have. "Run the numbers again," he said, his voice lower now, controlled, but carrying a different kind of authority, not the certainty of being right, but the discipline of verifying when something feels off. And one of the men hesitated, clearly caught between confidence and doubt. "We already validated those projections," he replied, but Ethan did not look at him. His eyes remained on Claire for a second longer before shifting away. "Do it again," he repeated, and this time there was no resistance, just movement, quiet, immediate, as phones were pulled out, calculations reopened, assumptions revisited, and the energy at the table transformed completely, no longer a celebration of a deal already won, but an investigation of something that might unravel. And Claire exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, before stepping back, her role in the moment already finished, because the truth, once seen, no longer needed her to stand beside it. The numbers did not take long to unravel once doubt had entered the room, because doubt, when placed in the right spot, spreads faster than confidence. And within seconds the quiet tapping of screens replaced the earlier ease of conversation, each man at the table retreating into his own calculations, cross-checking figures that had already been approved, already been trusted, and now suddenly felt unstable. And Ethan Caldwell remained still, not rushing them, not speaking, his presence now defined by restraint rather than control, his gaze occasionally drifting back to the closed folder as if the answer might still change if he looked at it differently. But it did not, because truth does not shift under pressure, only perception does. And across from him, the executive who had spoken earlier leaned forward again, his voice lower this time, less certain. "The conditional trigger, it is tied to projected revenue, not guaranteed revenue," he said slowly, as if hearing the sentence for the first time, and another voice followed, more urgent now. "If the threshold is not met, the liability transfers back, which means the valuation drops." And the realization moved through the table in quiet waves, each man reaching the same conclusion at a slightly different moment, their expressions tightening, their posture changing, the casual confidence gone, replaced by the careful awareness of something nearly overlooked. And no one laughed now, no one dismissed anything, because the scale of the mistake had settled in, not as panic, but as clarity, precise and heavy. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice even, measured. "How much?" And there was a brief pause, not because the answer was unknown, but because saying it out loud would make it real. And the response came, steady but restrained, approximately 200 million, depending on performance variance. And the number hung there, no longer just a figure mentioned in passing, but a confirmed consequence. And Ethan did not react immediately. He did not lean back or show frustration. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any visible emotion, because in that nod was acceptance, Not a failure, but a fact, and he reached for the folder again, opening it with the same controlled motion as before, his eyes scanning the page one more time, not searching for error now, but confirming the shape of what had been revealed. And when he closed it again, the decision had already formed. "We revised the terms," he said, his tone calm, decisive, leaving no room for debate, and the others moved quickly, adjusting, recalibrating. Because that was what professionals did when the ground shifted, they adapted, but there was something different in the room now, something quieter, more aware, and as the conversation resumed, it no longer flowed around him in the same effortless way. It moved with intention, with caution, each word considered, each assumption checked, and Claire Bennett was no longer part of it. Not visibly, because she had already stepped away, returning to her section with the same quiet efficiency as before, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence blending back into the background as if nothing had happened at all, and yet the space she had touched remained altered. The trajectory of a deal redirected by a single sentence spoken without force, without demand, and Ethan's gaze followed her once. Briefly, not in curiosity alone, but in recognition, the kind that does not announce itself, does not seek acknowledgement, but settles quietly, reshaping something internal. And then he looked away, back to the table, back to the work, but the silence that had passed between them lingered, not empty, but understood. The restaurant did not pause for revelations, it never did. The soft music continued, glasses were refilled, conversations rose and fell in quiet waves, and to anyone walking past Ethan Caldwell's table, it looked like business as usual, a group of well-dressed professionals adjusting details of a deal. Nothing more, nothing unusual. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted, not just in the numbers, but in the balance of certainty, because once a flaw had been exposed, even a corrected one, it left behind a trace, a question that lingered in the space between what was assumed and what was verified, and Ethan felt it, not as discomfort, but as awareness, a subtle recalibration of how he processed the room around him, and his attention, which had always been directed forward, toward outcomes, toward control, now moved differently, wider, more observant, and without turning his head, he was aware of Claire Bennett moving across the floor, her presence quiet, efficient, her interactions with other tables seamless, unaffected, as if the moment they had just shared did not exist outside of his own perception. And that in itself was unusual, because most people, when they stepped into his world even briefly, lingered, watched, waited for acknowledgement. But she did not. She had already returned to her role, not shrinking back, but simply continuing, and that absence of expectation caught his attention more than anything she had said. And one of the executives leaned toward him again, voice low, respectful now. "We should have legal review the entire agreement before proceeding," he suggested, and Ethan nodded once, already reaching the same conclusion. "We will," he replied, his tone steady, but there was no urgency in it, no frustration, just a quiet acceptance that the process needed to be reset. And as the conversation shifted into logistics, timelines, contingencies, his focus drifted again, not away from the deal, but towards something else that had entered the equation without invitation, a variable he had not accounted for. And he did not like variables he did not understand. And yet this one did not feel like a threat. It felt like clarity, like something that had been missing rather than something that disrupted. And when Claire passed by the table again, this time to clear an empty glass, he spoke, not loudly, not to command attention, but just enough for her to hear. "Wait." And the word was simple, controlled, but it carried weight, and she stopped, turning slightly toward him, her expression neutral, professional, as if nothing about this interaction was different from any other request. And for a brief moment, Ethan did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how to say it, which was something he rarely had to consider. And when he did, his voice was quieter than before. "What is your name?" And the question was direct, but not dismissive, not casual, and Claire met his gaze without hesitation. "Claire Bennett," she replied, her tone even, and he nodded once, as if committing the name to memory rather than simply acknowledging it. And there was a pause, brief but present, where the next expected step would have been praise, or reward, or some form of recognition that fit the structure of his world, but it did not come, not because he did not recognize what she had done, but because the moment did not call for transaction, it called for understanding, and so he asked something else instead, something that did not belong to the script of power. How did you see it? And Claire did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she was considering how much of the truth to give, and when she spoke, it was simple, stripped of complexity. The numbers did not match the assumption, she said, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that carried more depth than it appeared, and Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, not searching for more words, but recognizing that there were none to be given, and he nodded again, slower this time. Understood, he said, and Claire inclined her head slightly before stepping away, returning to the flow of the room, leaving behind a silence that did not need to be filled, because for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell was not the only one in control of the conversation, and he did not try to take it back. The conversation at the table resumed, but it no longer carried the same effortless rhythm. Each sentence now passed through a layer of quiet scrutiny. Each assumption weighed before being spoken, and Ethan Caldwell noticed it immediately, not as a disruption, but as an improvement, the kind that sharpened rather than slowed, and he allowed it to continue, guiding only when necessary, his voice measured, his decisions deliberate. But part of his attention remained elsewhere, not distracted, but divided, tracking something beyond the numbers, beyond the deal itself. And across the room, Claire Bennett continued her work without pause, her movements precise, her presence steady, as if nothing in her world had shifted at all, and that contrast settled into Ethan's thoughts, the difference between someone who carried significance loudly and someone who carried it without announcement. And he found himself watching the way she moved through the space, not in admiration, not in curiosity, alone, but in analysis, trying to understand how someone positioned so far outside his sphere had seen what his entire team had missed. And one of the executives spoke again, outlining revised terms, his tone careful now, deferential, and Ethan responded with quiet clarity, adjusting details, refining structure, the conversation moving forward with a new precision that had not been there before. But even as he spoke, a question remained, not about the deal, but about perception itself, about how easily certainty could mask oversight, and how rarely someone challenged it without agenda. And when the meeting finally began to wind down, the tension that had replaced confidence softened, not into relief, but into controlled resolution, and papers were gathered, phones set aside, agreements postponed rather than finalized, and Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling once, not out of fatigue, but out of acknowledgement that the outcome of the evening had shifted in a way he had not anticipated. And as the others began to stand, offering brief remarks about next steps and follow-ups, he remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze moving once more across the room until it found Claire again, now at a different table, speaking quietly to a guest, her tone polite, composed, her attention fully present in a way that suggested she treated every interaction with the same level of care, regardless of who sat in front of her. And Ethan stood then, adjusting his jacket with a small, practiced motion, his posture returning to its usual authority, but something within it had changed, subtle, but real, and as he stepped away from the table, one of his colleagues approached him, lowering his voice. "That was close," he said, a hint of disbelief still lingering. And Ethan nodded once. "Closer than it should have been," he replied, his tone even, not defensive, not dismissive, simply factual, and the man hesitated before adding, "You think she knew exactly what she was saying?" And Ethan paused, just briefly, his gaze shifting again toward Claire, who was now placing a check on a table with the same quiet efficiency as before, and he considered the question, not quickly, not casually, but with the same precision he applied to everything that mattered. And when he answered, his voice was calm, certain in a different way than before. "She did not guess," he said, and that was all, because anything more would have reduced what had happened into something simpler than it was, and he did not intend to simplify it. And without another word, he moved toward the exit, but his pace slowed just slightly as he passed her section, not enough to draw attention, just enough to align timing. And when she stepped away from her table, Their paths crossed again, close, but not directly, and for a brief moment, neither spoke, because nothing needed to be said, and yet the silence between them was not empty. It carried recognition, quiet and complete, before he continued on, leaving the restaurant behind, but not the shift that had taken place within it. The night air outside carried a quiet chill, the kind that sharpened thought rather than distracted from it, and Ethan Caldwell paused just before stepping into the waiting car, his hand resting briefly on the door without opening it, his mind not on the traffic, not on the next meeting already scheduled on his calendar, but on a single moment that had refused to fade, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. And precision was something he respected more than anything else. And inside the restaurant, Claire Bennett moved through the final stretch of her shift, the pace slowing slightly as tables emptied and conversations thinned, her steps still measured, her attention still exact, as if the weight of what had happened earlier had no claim on her at all, and in truth, it did not, because she had not stepped into that moment for recognition, only for correction, and once it was done, it belonged to the people it affected, not to her, and she wiped down a table with the same quiet focus she had shown all evening, her mind already moving forward, organizing the next tasks, the next details, the next small responsibilities that required the same level of care as everything before. And when she reached the service station, another server glanced at her, curiosity lingering just beneath a casual tone. "What was that about earlier?" she asked, not directly, but enough to acknowledge that something had been noticed, and Claire shook her head slightly, not dismissive, not secretive, just simple. "Nothing important," she replied, and the answer was not false, because importance, in her world, was not measured by scale, but by necessity, and what she had done had been necessary, nothing more, nothing less. And across the street, Ethan finally opened the car door, but instead of getting in, he straightened, his gaze drifting back toward the restaurant windows, where the warm light softened the outlines of movement inside, and for a brief moment, he considered the unfamiliar impulse to return, to ask more, to understand more, but he did not act on it, not because it lacked value, but because he recognized that not every answer required immediate pursuit. Some required distance, reflection, and he stepped into the car, the door closing with a quiet finality that separated the two spaces, but not the connection between them. And as the car pulled away, the city lights sliding past in blurred patterns, his thoughts did not move on as quickly as they usually did. They stayed, focused, revisiting the sequence not to question it, but to learn from it, to understand how a detail so clear could have been missed, and more importantly, how someone outside the system had seen it without hesitation. And back inside, Claire finished her shift, untied her apron, folded it neatly, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged, and when she stepped out into the same night air, the restaurant behind her faded into just another place. Just another shift completed, and she walked in the opposite direction, her pace steady, her mind already quiet, because for her, the moment had passed completely, leaving no trace of tension, no need for reflection, only the simple continuation of a life built on noticing what others overlooked. And as the distance between them grew, moving in opposite directions under the same city sky, the balance between their worlds had shifted in a way neither of them would speak about, but both would carry forward, differently, quietly, and permanently. The morning arrived without ceremony, the city already in motion before the sun had fully settled over the skyline, and inside a glass-walled office several floors above the street, Ethan Caldwell stood facing the window, a tablet in his hand, the revised projections displayed in clean, precise columns, numbers adjusted, risks recalculated, the error from the night before now fully exposed and corrected. And yet he did not move past it as quickly as he normally would have, because something about the origin of that correction continued to hold his attention, not the mistake itself, but how it had been seen, and more importantly, who had seen it. And behind him, his assistant stepped in quietly, placing a folder on the desk with the efficiency of someone who understood timing without needing instruction. "Legal has completed the review," she said, her voice calm, professional, and Ethan nodded slightly, setting the tablet down. "Any additional concerns?" he asked, already expecting the answer, and she shook her head. Nothing beyond what was identified last night. Everything else aligns. And he acknowledged it with a brief glance. But his focus did not settle there. Instead, he asked a different question, one that did not belong to the usual sequence of his morning briefings. The restaurant from last night, La Mirin, what do we know about it? And his assistant paused for a fraction of a second, not confused, but adjusting, shifting from one context to another without hesitation. It is a privately owned establishment, high-end clientele, no notable financial issues. Why? She asked, not out of curiosity, but to understand direction, and Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze returning to the window, the reflection of the city stretching endlessly outward. Nothing urgent, he said finally, his tone even, but the question had already set something in motion, and inside a small apartment across town, Claire Bennett sat at a narrow kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her, pages filled with neat, structured handwriting, columns of figures, notes in the margins, her pen moving steadily as she worked through another set of calculations, unrelated to the restaurant, unrelated to the previous night. Because her life did not revolve around moments, it revolved around patterns, consistency, the quiet discipline of understanding systems that most people never noticed. And a cup of coffee sat beside her, untouched, slowly cooling as her attention remained fixed on the page. And outside, the sounds of the city filtered in through a slightly open window, distant traffic, a passing voice, the ordinary rhythm of a morning that carried no indication of what had already been set into motion. And back in his office, Ethan turned from the window, his decision forming not from impulse, but from clarity, the same clarity that had guided every major move he had ever made. And he picked up the folder from his desk, not the one containing the deal, but a blank one, untouched, and he placed it in front of him, opening it with deliberate care, as if creating space for something new, something not yet defined. And for a moment, he simply stood there, considering, not whether to act, but how, because some opportunities did not announce themselves with scale or urgency. They appeared quietly, requiring recognition rather than pursuit. And across the city, Claire closed her notebook, aligning the edges with a small, precise motion. Her work for the morning complete, and she stood, moving toward the door with the same calm efficiency that defined everything she did, unaware that somewhere else, in a different world built on entirely different rules, a decision was being made that would eventually intersect with her path again, not by coincidence, but by recognition, the kind that once formed, does not easily fade. 3 days passed before the moment returned, not as a memory, but as a decision made real. And inside La Mirin, the late afternoon light filtered softly through the tall windows, casting long reflections across polished surfaces as Claire Bennett moved through the quiet pre-dinner setup, aligning cutlery, checking reservations, her movements steady, familiar, untouched by anything beyond the rhythm of her work. And when the door opened, the sound barely registered at first, just another arrival in a place where people came and went without consequence. But the shift in attention came not from the entrance itself, but from the presence that followed, controlled, deliberate. And Ethan Caldwell stepped inside without announcement, his posture composed, his expression neutral, not seeking attention, yet drawing it effortlessly. And Claire noticed him not immediately, but naturally, the way she noticed everything, a subtle change in the room, a pattern slightly altered. And when her eyes met his, there was no surprise in her expression, no reaction that suggested expectation or uncertainty, only recognition, quiet and complete. And she approached with the same professionalism she offered every guest, stopping at a respectful distance. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice even. And Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "I would like a table," he replied, simple, direct. And she gestured toward a corner table by the window, one that offered both privacy and clarity, a place where conversation did not need to compete with the room. And as he sat, she placed a glass of water in front of him with practiced precision, her movements unchanged, as if the context between them had never extended beyond a standard interaction. And for a moment, neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them relied on words to define what had already been understood. And Ethan reached into his jacket, placing a thin folder on the table, not sliding it toward her, not presenting it as an offer, but simply setting it there. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but without distance. "I reviewed everything again," he said, not referring to the deal alone, but to the sequence that had followed, the realization, the correction, the origin of it all. And Claire listened without interrupting, her attention focused, not on the folder, but on him. And he continued, "What you saw was not luck, it was structure, and structure matters." And he paused briefly, not for effect, but for precision, choosing his next words with care. "I do not usually invite variables into my system, but I also do not ignore clarity when I see it." And he opened the folder then, turning it slightly so it faced her, revealing not a contract, not an offer wrapped in complexity, but something simpler, cleaner, an opportunity, defined not by position, but by purpose. And Claire's eyes moved over the page briefly, taking in the details without reaction, her expression unchanged. And when she looked back at him, there was no immediate answer, no quick acceptance or refusal, only a quiet pause where thought replaced impulse. And Ethan did not rush her, did not fill the silence, because he understood that decisions made with clarity did not require pressure. And after a moment, she spoke, her voice as steady as it had been the first time. "If I accept, it will not be because of the title," she said, and he nodded slightly, already expecting that. And she continued, "It will be because the work makes sense." And there was no challenge in her tone, no negotiation, only a condition rooted in the same logic that had brought them to this moment. And Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into a smile, but into something closer to respect. "That is the only reason it should be," he replied, and the space between them settled into something balanced, no longer defined by position, but by recognition. And outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the quiet alignment taking place within. And as Claire closed the folder gently, not yet deciding, but not dismissing it either, the moment held its shape, calm, precise, and complete, because sometimes the most powerful changes do not arrive with noise, they arrive with understanding, and remain because they are true.